Hello, everyone. This is Rafi. I'm here with Nick Norwitz this week back on the podcast, the first repeat guest. Hi, Nick. How's it going?
Hey, Raphael, good. Glad to be here.
It's it's really cool to have you back on again. We had a great talk the first time. People should check it out. I think it was back in when was that? Earlier 2021 or even earlier?
Yeah, I forget. All I do remember about it is it was one of those. It was the weird Twitter meeting where we thought we were like
Right.
arguing with each other. We were saying the exact same thing.
Right. Yeah. People should check that out. I think it's actually educational to see how a productive disagreement, which actually wasn't even a disagreement, ended up being super productive. So I like that as an example.
You thought I was being pro calories in, calories out, and I thought you were being pro calories in, calories out. I'm like, whoa, nonsense.
Right, that's true. That's kind of funny. And we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about the calories in, calories out, because it's the eternal subject, or the horse that will never die, however much you beat it to death. And and the protein question has come up recently. There's some nuance we'd love to explore there, and then we'll just see what else comes up and go from there.
For sure.
Yeah.
I guess you and I were talking beforehand about starting with protein. What a high protein diet is, because there's so much enthusiasm right now, especially in the low carb community, about like high protein diets. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but both of us would tend to agree higher protein diets, at least higher than is generally recommended by, say, like the daily reference intake, is a good idea. But it's all about like your comparison group. So I don't think a lot of people realize that the US, like FDA, has set a daily value for protein at 50 grams per 2,000 kilocalorie diet. So if you're looking at a nutrition label, like if I take a pack of sardines and it says this is 18 grams of protein, that is over a third of my total intake for a day. So you extrapolate, that's like a single chicken breast for a fully grown person. Like that's all the protein you get in a day. A single decent sized chicken breast. And then you can't even have like a Brussels sprout because that has more protein. That will be higher than that 50. Not saying that you can't, but they're not saying that you can't have that. But that is the threshold of comparison in a lot of these studies. And I think one of the reasons that the concept of high protein gets misunderstood, because people think of that as like loading on the steak, loading on the chicken, when it's like, greater than 50 grams per day, which is really not that much, or the dietary reference intake, which is in grams per pound. And those are two different ways to break down protein. Percent of intake or grams per pound is 0.36 grams per pound, which is nothing. That's only for 160 pound person. That's like 57.6 grams, which again is nothing. So a fully grown 160 pound man, you get one about 6 ounce lean chicken breast per day, and then a single Brussels sprout later on in the day will put you over what is the daily reference intake. I think that's a place to start with the conversations. Like, what is the point of comparison? And a lot of studies, like that is normal protein or low protein, which is kind of absurd.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's when you actually look at the absolute figures and what the DRI sets as a sort of baseline, and then when we use these terms high protein, super loosely, right? We could be talking about anything above that DRI. We could be talking about something triple what the average low carber, would keto person would be eating. So it's really funky. We have a context issue here, and we have a definition issue, which is often the case in nutrition, because these things are not easy to pin down. So, for example, the example you gave of the chicken breast and not being able to go over it. So this is a good one, because you quickly realize that not only is the quantity actually really small and inadequate, in my opinion, for the vast majority of people, it's also the case that the DRIs don't distinguish between animal and plant protein. And that is actually a big deal. So there are some studies which suggest like the leucine anabolic response is considerably lower on plant protein. And you rightly pointed out that is not an outcome study, meaning we don't have the confirmation that this translate into lean body mass increases and all that stuff. but it's just to say that there are qualitative differences that matter in the source of protein. And if you take this to, let's say, the extreme, and you have these plant-based diets where there's a lot of corn, for example, you're going to be deficient in certain essential amino acids. So go ahead.
No, and we'll get into that. One thing I just want to make clear, because I think we both keep saying it, and I don't want us to get called out for it, is the DRI of 0.36. If you go above that, they're not setting the DRI or the label on nutrition saying like this is the maximum you should get. So it's not like the government is saying you shouldn't eat more protein than this per se. We're just saying that is the point of contrast, such that there literally are studies that define high protein, like Sorensen, I think 2012 was 0.5 grams per pound was their high protein diet. Whereas I would argue in that study, what they're doing is they're comparing high protein to what really is deficient protein. And then there are other studies like Helen 2014 where high protein is 1.4 grams per pound. So that's a threefold difference in grams per pound. So what we're basically just saying is that there's a poor definition for, even if you just take crude protein, what high protein is. And then what you're saying on top of that is, the DRI, it actually makes certain assumptions about protein quality. It assumes, optimal protein bioavailability for somebody who's using it optimally. So if you're older and not using protein as well, you might need a little bit more. Or if you're not consuming an optimal source, and generally, and we can get into this next, although there's a couple things we'll bounce around to is, plant proteins tend not to be an optimal source. And that study you were referencing, you actually just sent me before, looking at different plant protein complexes versus, I think, whey protein isolate was the control. And then they were looking at the area under the curve of the essential amino acids in the blood as a proxy of basically protein quality. The interesting thing about that study, and I do caveat it as a not clinical outcome study, but the interesting thing about that study is, if I'm correct, they actually chose plant proteins that were the highest in the PDCAS score.
Yeah, they were hydrolyzed. Yeah.
So there are different basic metrics of protein quality. The two most common are PDCAS, which I think stands for protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. And that's the most common one, and it's on a scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being best, like optimal, and 0 being just crap protein. And then there's
one is eggs or milk, right?
Eggs and milk are like a solid 1. Yeah, basically all animal proteins are pretty much a 1. And by contrast, I think chickpeas are like 0.74, and things like peanuts or wheat bran score like a 0.5. And I think almonds are a 0.4. So that's not saying that almonds have less protein or peanuts have less protein than meat. They're like less protein concentrated. It's saying if you take 10 grams of protein from peanuts, and you take 10 grams of protein from an egg or a chicken breast or a ribeye steak, the protein in the peanuts, gram for gram of protein, is a lower quality. And then there's the newer DIAS score, which is the digestible indispensable amino acid score, which is considered to be a better metric, but they're just like, there's less data on all the foods in their DIAS scores because how you have to measure it. But just a DIAS score is another metric. Again, 1.0 or 100% is an excellent protein. And on the DIAS score, you can actually score a little bit above a 1. So I think like whey protein is actually above a 1 on DIAS, although you can't max above a 1 on PDCAS. And then things between a 0.75 and a 9.9 are good, and those that receive less than a 0.75 are just no protein quality claim, which includes things like spinach, beans, tree nuts, and a lot of vegetables. So like a lot of, they get no protein quality claim, no matter how much protein they have on a DIAS score. That doesn't mean the protein's useless, but I think like, step one going beyond protein amount is protein quality based on these general metrics. And what was the interesting thing about your study was it was saying like, even if you account for, high PDCAS score by using hydrolyzed, vegetable protein complexes, it still might be inferior to animal proteins just because of probably the composition of the amino acids. So all proteins, well, not all of them, but there are 20 basic protein building blocks, and based on the different ratios of these proteins, I think you can get different responses in the body.
Yeah,
So that was
absolutely. Yeah, so we have the absolute amount that we agree is sort of the DRI set too low. Then we have the problem of the context of what's high protein, what are we comparing it to, and then we have the quality question. And this sort of, I guess we can go from there to talk about there. So I'll bring up the Diet Doctor article because it's interesting and it's actually useful, I think, as an exercise to think this through. So the article was set up in a way where basically it was about busting myths, right, surrounding keto. And the general gist of it was keto is put forth as this, lots of fat diet. And the first argument was basically, well, it's not actually a lots of fat diet. It's actually most of the studies that were done on it show that they don't actually increase fat or don't increase it significantly. And the argument,
absolute facts, we're saying. So we're
right,
saying
the
if somebody
absolute
goes
amount.
from a standard diet to a keto diet, I think the
Yeah.
article said average fat increase was like 18.
Yeah.
Which I think is an accurate statement. We're talking about absolutes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely accurate. And the question that sort of came to my mind was like, but ketogenic diets, even if they don't increase fat in the absolute amounts, because a lot of people will start it to lose fat, and thus when people lose fat, they just tend to eat less and eat less fat, especially because of the decades of indoctrination. But they still, if they are doing a ketogenic diet, their ratio of fat as a percentage of kilocalories really does increase, even if you're calorie restricting, and even if you're not aiming for, I don't know, 85% fat, you're still aiming for 60% fat. That's still way more than, let's say, the average American diet, which might be 35, 45% fat.
Yeah.
So to me, either way you look at it, yeah, you're going to eat, quote, more fat on keto. That's not an unreasonable way to simplify it, right? We don't have to overcomplicate this. Keto is a fatty diet. Now, yes, the absolute might not be, we can go through that nuance, but setting it up as a myth for me was the first red flag, because I'm like, well, we're trying to overcomplicate this. We're not speaking like down to earth to people here.
Yeah, I mean, that what you just pointed out really gets to a heart of, I think, the problem with high fat or high protein, really, and that is, what are we using as a measuring stick, a definition? Are we using absolute numbers? Are we using, say, grams per pound in terms of protein, or are we using proportion of total caloric intake? And I think people gravitate towards different definitions and think that they're interchangeable when they're not. Not only do we have not have a certain threshold for what we consider, say, high protein, but we're not even using similar measuring sticks a lot of the time, and that leads to a lot of confusion. So, like with at least respect to high protein, I know we're going to be shifting back and forth probably between topics, just talking ad lib, but a 30% kcal from protein diet for me would be insane. It would be like something like 3.5 or 4 grams of protein per pound.
Right.
Per pound, not kilogram, per pound, which is absurd. Like I would get sick eating that. But if somebody has lower energy demands than me, that might be very appropriate. We might be eating the same grams per pound, but I might be eating, half as many kcals as percent of my total caloric intake. And the same goes for fat as well, in terms of absolutes and relatives. But I think so. You read it with that in mind, that you were kind of defining high fat as proportion of fat, whereas I think what the intention of the article was, and I think we can talk about the difference between intention and perception, and I think the latter is more important. I'd agree, you'd agree, I think Brett would agree. He was very respectful in his replies and very open-minded. I think we were both impressed, as he always is. But the intention, I think, was to dispel the perception that my impression is a minority of people, that if you are on a low-carb diet, fat is a free macronutrient. As in, I'm trying to lose weight, so I go keto. So I can stick butter in my coffee and I can have fat bombs with sweetener, as much as I want, and I'm still going to lose weight. And I think that's the perception that Diet Doctor is trying to bust. And maybe that's one of the reasons, we can talk about why you think there's so much high protein enthusiasm, but I think there are influencers in the space who their intention is to dispel that perception, because we focus on high fat. People get excited when they, quote, restrict themselves from carbohydrates, that I can indulge in this fat, and it almost becomes this weird virtue signaling thing, which I think a lot of us are susceptible to. It's like, oh, look at like this like fatty piece of like, you know, pork belly that I'm dunking in hollandaise. It's just like people like showing off their food. It's just part of culture, especially media culture. And I think that overextends into people thinking that they can just eat as much fat as they want. And that's not, strictly speaking, true, especially when it's in, I think, liquid form or when it's mixed in with sweeteners. I think it is pretty hard to overeat. Like if you were just gonna have, I'm gonna have real food fats like avocado and ribeye steak and, you know, fatty fish, then I think it'd be pretty hard to overeat on fats. But that's not how people often eat. They'll like gush things in oil, drown them in oil, and add things to drinks, that, this, that, and the other. Not everybody's metabolism can handle that. So I just want to frame that as I think that was the intention. But that's not what a lot of people perceived, including you. So I'll let you go on now about what you were saying.
Yeah, and look, Adele Haidt, who wrote the article, did specify that the relative amounts were higher, which is, again, fine. But then why are you presenting it as a myth? Why? See, it's this like clickbaity, antagonistic aspect that doesn't do the subject justice, because if the point was, as you say, trying to get people to be a bit more realistic and understand that if the myth was fat isn't free, okay, that's totally true, right? Fat isn't free. It has calories, it has endocrine effects, it counts, no problem. That's a total myth. But calling it you eat lots more fat on keto, that's not a myth, that's a nuance, right? And that's the kind of the issue that I had. So if we, just to go over them very quickly, then we can dig into them. The second myth was eating fat burns body fat. So you kind of talked about this here. You gave the example of bulletproof coffee. And everyone hates Dave Asprey now in the low carb world. So it's like super cool to like hate on Dave Asprey because it's the easy thing to do. But honestly, I think people have forgotten, and it's not just anecdotes. I mean, we hear a lot of them if you're listening, but there are people who genuinely decided they were on low carb or keto, and they said, it's not working that well, you know, I'm going to increase the fat, and they lost body fat.
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you. Like it just happens. If you're telling me people increase the protein, lost body fat, I'm like, okay, I'll believe you. And I'm doing the same with fat. So if we accept that those things happen, why are we presenting it as a myth? Maybe it could be argued like, well, we estimate high protein to work for 80% of people or something, or 90% of people. That would be like, okay, like I can debate that with you. But just calling it a myth, fat burns body fat, that's nonsense. When you eat fat, you do increase fat oxidation. I mean, it's, you know.
Well, when you habituate to eating fat. So I think, again, here's intention.
Especially.
Intention was, you can't just, if you eat more fat in your diet, what you're basically doing is you're going to be, you know, at a point inhibiting the burning of your own body fat. Your body's going to pull from body fat, or it's going to pull from dietary fat. So if you have too much, if you want to lose body fat and you're eating too much dietary fat, which you can do, then you won't pull as much body fat. That was the intention. The perception, at least I think a potential perception, is that I should eat less fat, or there's this fat phobia. And that's problematic, because in the end, it's really a choice. You can't just eat protein. You can't. It's not sustainable long-term, and it's not healthy. So you have to choose between carbs and fat. And this is historically the problem we had, is that fat was vilified, there was fat phobia, so people chose carbs. And metabolically, that just tends to happen as well. People calorically restrict, you'll see them go gravitate straight towards carbs. And so there's a risk, I think, again, attention perception, but I perceive a sense of reinstating a little bit of fat phobia from a group diet doctor that like I hold up in such high esteem that like if they even hint at that, I think that's slightly problematic, without really caveating that or thinking about how they frame it, which to their credit, I think they're doing to a tremendous extent. But you know, that's the problem I see. And it's the same with bulletproof coffee. It's like, think about, you know, individual cases. Okay, does putting butter in your coffee help you burn body fat? Absolutely not. And it's the same with exogenous ketones. Did they burn body fat? Absolutely not. But if you're choosing between having pancakes for breakfast or having bulletproof coffee or some exogenous ketones to keep you over to lunch, then there's a lesser of two evils phenomenon when you're choosing between your macronutrients or you're choosing between your bulletproof coffee or another breakfast. So again, intention perception, how are people going to take this? And I am probably more sensitized and personally more worried about reinstating fat phobia than I am about caveating, oh, you know, shouldn't have excess fat, which I give people credit. I think most people know that you can't eat 10,000 calories if your carbs are zero and expect to lose weight. I feel like most people know that.
Not 10,000 calories, but can you eat 500 more calories than what you need to maintain weight and still lose inches off your waist? I think you can. I really think you can. And I think people have done the experiment. And there's Josh Blackburn, who I speak to on Twitter often. And he's doing an experiment currently where he's purposely gone hypercaloric, specifically with fat, to actually test this on himself. So far, after I think it's been like 2 weeks or something, he's lost an inch off his waist, and he's literally had difficulty continuing to eat as much as he has. So like I can't tell you this is going to work long term. I can't make all these promises, but I do know for a fact that you can increase your calories specifically from fat and lose body fat. And I think the moment you recognize that, even if it's like an outlier, you gotta include that in your framework. You can't ignore it. It's not, you know, it's not going to push your ideas forward. You're not going to help more people by ignoring it. In fact, you might be missing out on more people than you know if you tend to ignore those things. So I get that people want to help newbies avoid the big mistakes. That's totally fine. But why are we setting it up as a myth? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they can get a bit of the nuance, you know? That was my main issue, because these things are actually genuinely debatable, right? They're debatable. We know that if you take it to the extreme, then yeah, sure, if you just overdo the fat, you're going to make it harder for yourself. But at the same time, I don't know why, but some people can lose fat that way. And some people like Amber and Shaban have tried the protein thing, and they're very diligent. I mean, you're not going to find more diligent self-experimenters than those two and Dave Feldman, right? They have had issues with hunger. They have not lost the excess fat that they would like to lose, and they've tried this. They have found success with a higher fat version to some extent, and it's still ongoing work, but that actually happened. And again, the more we ignore the anecdotes, the further away from the truth that we get, you know? Imagine if we didn't do that with low carb in the 90s and Atkins was just an anecdote. Look what it spurred today, right? Like, we have to have a little humility and historical perspective here, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I will say there is so much between person variability. I do personally better on high fat, and also there was a study. It was like Levine 1999. I think it was in Science or Nature, like a top journal, but they actually did overfeed people 1,000 kilocalories per day, like multiple people, and they found a 10-fold difference in fat storage.
Right.
Accounted for by non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So some people, their body will, adapt to increase energy expenditure. I think what we need to understand is that, it's in that delta E equals energy in minus energy out, in that equation, the independent variable is the delta E. So when you're manipulating your macronutrients to shift where your body wants that delta E to be, it's going to adjust the E in and E out, and sometimes non-intuitive ways, like people who increase their fat intake and then lose inches on their waist, or even lose a little bit of weight. I would speculate that it might more be a fat distribution thing, per se, but even that is relevant. Plus, I just don't know how. I think we need more studies in this area, but it goes both ways. So, for example, for protein, a lot of people now are trying to argue that higher protein is better. Right? It improves body composition. In fact, this is one of the things that annoys me about high protein, is it always, without claiming it, tends to focus on body composition. Like it masquerades as this is healthier for you, but the talk's always about body composition. So I actually pointed that out to Brett. He immediately changed the title of that article. He's like, oh, that's a good point. This is myths about fat for weight loss, which is distinct. Right. Even so, there's a lot of nuance. So I think somebody at Doctor, posted this like review article. It was a meta-analysis, a systematic review, a dose-response relationship between protein intake and muscle mass increase. And I think the argument was like, if you eat more protein, you just gain muscle mass basically without limit. At least without limit within the range that they were analyzing. It was by Tagawa et al. And it was an interesting review. I thought it was extremely compelling overall, but there was some nuance to it. So for example, if you weren't resistance training and you actually accounted for changes in body weight, then eating more protein above, I think it was like 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day actually made your body composition worse,
right? Not
better.
And we don't know why. Maybe they were eating more plant protein. We don't know why, right? Because it's associations here. We're not testing it.
Yeah, I forget exactly what the methodology was, and it was, like there were different multivariate analyses. So if you just ate more protein, you're going to gain muscle mass. Are you gaining just muscle mass and fat, or are you just gaining weight? Then presumably, if you control for body weight and resistance training, if you're not resistance training, it showed that higher protein levels made body composition worse. I'm not saying that if you eat more protein, you're going to gain fat and lose muscle. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, it's like figure, was it a 2i or something? It was showing this, and I'm just like, this is interesting. I actually think the review made a very compelling point overall about higher protein helping to increase muscle mass. I think it made a very compelling point, but then I just see this and I'm like, it's more complicated than we're giving it credit for. And the way, and I think this is what bothers both of us, is the way people talk about high protein right now. It's just more protein is better, to the point that people are tossing their egg yolks in the trash and eating lean chicken breast. And they're like low carb. Like, this is a formula for disaster in a lot of people. Yeah. If you're saying, oh, now I'm going to go for the egg whites and the lean chicken breast, and I'm also low carb, I'm like, this is just caloric restriction. This is starvation.
Exactly. And it's just a question of how you justify it. In the end, it's the same shit that got us in trouble in the 90s and the 80s with the egg white omelets, And look, I mean, so the methodology in that systematic review is important, because when people read a systematic review and they say, oh, they included, RCTs and experiments, so it must be like super informative in terms of hard outcomes experiments. Well, not exactly, because what they did was actually use modeling. And people might be familiar with the word modeling now because we heard about the COVID models and the mess that got us into. And that's no different when you're talking about protein. Models are limited, very, very limited. It's not that we shouldn't use them at all. It's just that the conclusions we take from them can be so different. And you gave the perfect example, right? You had model 3, which showed you that without resistance training, you would worsen your body composition. And the 2 other models showed that it doesn't matter, that you would have just improved your body composition. Why are we believing model 2 and 1 and not model 3? Why, you know what I mean? Let's be honest here about what's being done.
And it was controlling for body weight, so you weren't gaining body weight. It is interesting. And I mean, another thing about systematic reviews and meta-analyses, they're very valuable, I think, but people have to understand they're very noisy too. Yeah. If you've ever written one, it's really hard to define, how are you going to group things? What are the criteria for the study you're including? And if you do these forest plots and stuff, it doesn't capture the nuance or what are the conditions in each group. If you're doing a meta-analysis of high protein, we're talking about, quote, high protein can be defined in the literature as 0.5 grams per kilogram or 1.4, 1.5 grams per pound or 1.4 grams per pound. It can be widely varied, and you can set thresholds for your paper. But if you say, okay, it's above 0.7 grams per pound, is that 0.7 grams per pound? Is that 2 grams per pound? It varies widely. And they actually, in this meta-analysis, they did group it by, amount of protein. But for a comparison, an analogy that might hit home for people, imagine you did, a systematic review of all studies looking at the correlation between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. I bet you it would show, it does show a positive association. But that's missing the nuance of what about the population? What if one of those studies was on lean mass hyperresponders and it showed that higher LDL did not correlate with cardiovascular risk? It would get lost in the noise of the systematic review. in all the different conditions. So I think there are a lot of variables people have to consider. And maybe this is something we can talk about because it's probably the most relevant. Is like, what are the questions you need to ask yourself about what high protein means for you? And I think we have to talk about are like how activity affects your protein intake, how leanness affects your protein intake, and whether you're restricting calories. I'd say those are the big three. I mean, then there's like age and stuff, but would I would say those are the big three. And like, if you're more active, we'll go through these one by one. You'll, be breaking down protein if you're working out, especially if you're lifting, so you'll need more protein in terms of gram per pound. Except you'll need less protein in terms of percent of total calories because the energy expenditure factor is going to go up more than the increase in protein. So if you're, you want to eat 0.6 grams per pound when you're not working out, and when you're working out hard, 1 gram per pound, that's going to be an increase, but you're actually probably going to decrease your percent of protein as energy. So that's the activity piece. And then there's the leanness piece. And I want to unpack this a little bit. My understanding is, simply the higher your body fat, the less protein you need in grams per pound for protein. That's pretty intuitive because you need protein to support your lean mass. So if you have more body fat, a lower proportion of your body mass is lean mass. That being relatively simple, but I think that there's a little bit more to it, and that overlaps with the restricting calories piece. So, if you're restricting calories in any bodybuilder can tell you this, you're going to need to boost your protein to protect against loss of lean mass, right? And so this is probably the particular context where like protein to energy ratio really is most important. It's like if you are a competitive bodybuilder trying to get from 7% body fat to 4% body fat, you don't have to worry about ketosis. Then yeah, you probably should hammer protein really high and cut your carbs and fat before the competition. That's a very specific case. So let's not generalize it. But in that circumstance, high protein probably is a good idea. But the leaner you are while you're restricting, my impression is the stronger this effect might be because you have less local fat to fuel your muscles. And right now I'm speculating a little bit, inspired in part by lean mass hyperresponders. Like there's this phenotype like where if you have lower body fat, you have an increase in VLDL production, presumably an increased LDL. This is Dave Feldman's model because your local fat isn't able to supply as much fuel. So the way I think about it is kind of like this. Let's say you're really lean and say you're obese and you're keto and you're running. There's a lot of fat mass over your quadricep. So the free fatty acids are going to get released in bulk and feed your quadricep muscle. If you're really lean and there's less local fat, you might need a support. You might get less direct local free fatty acid supply, and so you might need more global trafficking via LDL. And the same concept goes for leanness and protein demand during a caloric deficit. The leaner you are,
the more access to your fat you have by default, basically.
The fat you have is a buffer.
Right.
So locally, you might be able to supply fat as a buffer if you're more obese, but the leaner you are, the more protein you might need, which again compounds on the higher your body fat, the less protein you need concept. Because think about the people who are interested in high protein for body composition. They're generally already super lean and they're looking to optimize. Go from 7% body fat to 4% or from 12% to 8%, which is not most people. And so they're presumably trying to lose weight. So if they're CICO files, they're going to be trying to cut calories, or like acutely that will work. But before competition, that will work. In which case you'll bank up the protein. And then you get, this logic that higher protein diets will improve body composition in general. And that's a very, very specific circumstance that I just don't, my trouble is that there's this like domino effect where that logic is propagating into broader nutrition.
Yeah.
Higher protein is better for body composition. And frankly speaking, we just gave an example of one case that is inaccurate. We know anecdotes about that. We just talked about a meta-analysis showing that is not always accurate. That simple message is inaccurate. And I am very sensitive to simple messages because there are a lot of terms, not only in nutrition, but also in politics. I'm sure we both can think of one, which are really sexy and people gravitate towards them. And And they make a lot of sense on the surface, but they're super dangerous. And I think, calories in, calories out, high protein, those are both in that category, where they're dangerous because the lay public
who the message is meant
I
for.
want to say we can be easily deceived, because that seems patronizing, and I don't mean it like that. But
no, but it's true, they can, because you and I can be easily deceived as well, and we're not lay public.
Right. And so when you say something like higher protein is better for XYZ reasons, and you say calories in, calories out, it's like, well, yeah, calories in the end do matter. If you want to equate calories to energy, and you want to say, thermodynamics must apply to humans, then 100% you're right. But that's just, it's, and I said this before probably because I always say it, it's theoretically spot on. It's practically useless. Because, again, your body's going to adjust things in ways that are counterintuitive, but then what the opposition of the pro-CICO people can always do is they can always change the goalposts, saying, measure your calories in, calories out, that, and then a study shows that, controlling for caloric intake, you have increased total energy expenditure. We talk about these studies on a low-carb diet. Therefore, you would lose more weight eating the same number of calories, right? It's like, oh, but it is calories. Look, the energy expenditure went up. Like, yeah, like, so what? Like, that's the point. Right. The point is that the food you eat, the quality of the food you eat, the macronutrient composition, your hormones are dictating where your body wants its set point to be, and everything flows downstream of that, whether it be hunger and hunger drive, whether it be energy expenditure, whether it be your microbiome composition. There's like so many variables that you can't account for that it's completely, well, it's more harmful than helpful. I'm not going to say it's completely useless. It's more harmful than helpful to tell people to focus on this thing. And that's where I get a little bit worried with the high protein message, which is not to say don't prioritize protein as the center of your plate. But there's a difference between saying prioritizing proteins and adding fats to fullness, and saying have a high protein diet. Because what Diet Doctor means by high protein, they're very explicit about this, although I don't think a lot of people pick up on it, is they mean by high protein, and Brett said this on Twitter in our conversation, 1.2 grams per kilogram, not pound, per kilogram, to 2 grams per kilogram. So that's less than 1 gram per pound.
Right.
2.2 grams per kilogram would be 1 gram per pound. So they're
recommending
high protein diets less than 1 gram per pound. And in their high protein article, if you look at they're like, our high protein recipes are becoming very popular. I look at the macronutrient breakdown. I think the lowest fat, 5%, was 71%. 8,000 fat, which I think you would say is a high fat recipe, and I say I would say too.
Sure. Yeah. And the funny thing is that the recommendations that I give in my app Nutrita, they're actually from between 1.8 and up to, I think, 2.2 as the default range of gram per kilogram of protein per body weight. So in my app, I start off with high protein. And the reason why is because it's higher than Diet Doctor. And the reason is simple. It's not because this is like the only way, the magic way. It's because I'm trying to get people to eat more animal foods. Right? That's the easy way to do it. People think protein, they think animal food. So I'm like, yeah, let's just start off high, and then people can adjust, very much downwards. We tend to actually tell them, we tend to tell them that, oh, you're going in the red if you're taking the protein lower, just because I'm using a heuristic, right? I'm conscious that it's not totally accurate, and that's fine. I'm totally okay being practical, giving that to people. What I'm not okay with is when you have a pizza-y theory or a pizza-y diet purporting to explain mechanistically how things happen. And this is where it gets sneaky, because there are many concepts that sneak into this high protein diet. One of them, which is a big pet peeve of mine, is the vision of the adipose tissue, of the fat tissue, as this sort of passive energy reservoir. And this is literally what you see in the infographics shared about it, right? So you have this protein, this energy reservoir. The less energy that's coming in, the better, the more you're going to be able to pull on it. It just assumes that everyone has equal access to fat. Like, that's just the assumption, right? It doesn't, assume that different fat types could have different effects on it. Like it just assumes fat is energy. Energy is what you're minimizing from the reservoir. So just eat less of it. And oh, we know hunger is a problem, and protein is the best for hunger, which actually brings us to myth number 3. It keeps you full better than anything else. So you're not going to be hungry, and you're minimizing the energy. So you're doing an awesome version of CICO. Basically, it's like, yeah, it's CICO, but the smart way. That's kind of how it's sold. And once again, for bodybuilders who have great access to fat, for a certain amount of people, it's probably to some extent going to work out sort of that way, even if not for those mechanistic explanations. But when you realize that it's also equating energy from carbs and fat, right? The P to E ratio, then you get another layer of confounders where we know it's not the same. Like some people blow up on carbs. They just do. Like we know that it happens. So again, it's this not recognizing that it's a very imperfect, but maybe useful heuristic, and this insistence that it's a proper framework that doctors and researchers should be using. I'm like, that's just not the case. There are too many things that it can account for. That's why I insist on calling it a heuristic and not a theory, basically. And this actually brings us to the point about feeling full, which is really important. Yeah.
I want to get down to that's something that I'm interested to talk about. But just quick, generally, I do agree. I now try to be very careful about being inclusive of vegetarians, just because I know a lot. What would you say to someone who is vegetarian? Because we know you can build muscle on eating vegetarian. If there's literally one thing that game changers show, apart from everything else, even though it's the trashiest documentary ever, real out forever, it's like, yeah, you can build muscle. You might be a little bit build muscle eating plant-based. So what would your tips be to someone who is plant-based for whatever reason, say it's religious, and with respect to protein? What should they eat for protein? Do they need more protein? X, Y, Z.
I would recommend that they use a supplement that fits within their religious framework, and I would try to get them as close as I can to an animal source. Now, if they can't, because there's a big difference between vegans and vegetarians, so I would try that. I would try to see if there's an opening. If there's no opening, I would just give them a list of the plant foods that are highest in protein, which is pretty much beans, like for the most part. And I would say try to get as much as you can from there. I would tell them to resistance train, and I would tell them to try to get as much sleep as they can and not be inflamed. And that's going to be the best way to preserve your muscle mass. But in truth, I would very honestly tell them you're putting yourself at a handicap, and we can try to minimize it, but you're not going to quote improve from a healthy baseline. You are going to be catching up to a healthy baseline. And I would be very forthright with them about it, even if it's not something they would like to hear.
Yeah, no, I tend to. I mean, with the vegetarians, they can have like dairy, which is high quality protein, and if you're ovo-vegetarian, like eggs. And then I think I would agree. Soy and pea protein, if we want to go for like protein quality scores, they do score pretty well on PDC, ASS, and DIAS. So I tend to like recommend the soy and the pea proteins. I know some people have issues with phytoestrogens, but I'm not quite as concerned. I think those are pretty reasonable. And then an interesting point that was made, I forget who made it. I heard it on a podcast or something. Was we're probably talking to a low carb community. If you're a low carb vegetarian, one supplement you might want to add if you're adding supplements, maybe you want a little pea protein supplement, pea protein isolate or soy protein isolate, but carnitine. Because think about it, your body can make some carnitine, but if you go low carb and your demand for fat oxidation goes up, you might need more carnitine in your diet, but you're not going to be getting it on a vegetarian diet. So for people who don't know, carnitine is important in the shuttle that helps get fatty acids into mitochondria to get burned. So some people, I think, if you're vegetarian low carb, you might be susceptible to, especially vegan low carb, a carnitine deficiency. So, and that could also impair your body composition and your muscle building. So yeah, I think I would agree with you. Like soy protein or pea protein isolate, maybe a carnivore supplement could be cool. But anyway,
sure,
we can go on
absolutely.
to fullness. I didn't mean to
No, that's a good question,
topic, but I just thought it was an important topic.
Yeah, and the point about fullness is actually really important to me because it's one of those murky concepts where there's a lot of assumptions behind it, where if I am full, I will lose fat. Well, I actually think you lose fat, you tend to become less hungry. You feel more full because your body is accessing the fat better. So we have this causal reversal once again, and it's a big theoretical divide in the low carb in the diet world, right? And it actually does matter because a lot of the recommendations that you tend to see and which has been made in the Diet Doctor article was that basically protein and fiber, right? And the idea is very simple. It's the idea that, once again, protein is the most satiating macronutrient. That's what we always hear. That's debatable, but let's just assume it's the case for now. And then you have fiber, right? And this is actually back to the 1990s once again. And it's I forgot the researcher's name. Barbara Rolls. She had a book called Volumetrics, and the whole point of the book was to dilute the caloric density of your meals. How do you do that? With plant fibers. So it's kind of amazing how we've done like a 180 back to things that never worked, that never helped anyone, and now we're just trying to like hack it by adding lots of protein. It's still not going to work. Like, your body is not stupid. It's evolved to understand what energy is coming in, and if you're just trying to give it tons of fiber, it's not like it's going to be, oh great, we have lots of food. It's going to be like, what? I can't do anything with this. Like, my bacteria can barely ferment a few percent into usable energy in my colon. The rest is not digested. And all I've done is expand. I've taken up the real estate for foods that have the potential to normalize this issue that I'm having with my body composition, which is directing calories towards some tissue rather than others. And it's kind of disappointing to me because I thought we were past that. Like the volumetrics 1990s era, we were past that. But people, like, I'm not saying you shouldn't eat vegetables and that they can't make you feel good. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the idea that that is how it works, that just by displacing calories and tricking your body. No, that's not how it works.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's a matter of degree and at least perception. I think what Brad and Adele and I probably go for, if you're doing keto, we're not people, but we're not necessarily recommending that. Maybe it's good to have some, spinach or leafy greens with whatever meal you're having. And I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I know fiber works for some people. I do better on low fiber for myself for other reasons, but I agree. That doesn't work. And if it did, we could all be eating like pillows and cotton balls, but it doesn't. Or gastric banding would work, and it doesn't. It works for a little bit of time.
Exactly.
Making your stomach smaller, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
These surgeries that do work are the ones that change the way your intestines to change hormones. But I want to ask you a thought question, and I'm going to follow it with a second thought question, just to kind of get at what I think is a lost perspective with this satiety per calorie thing. All right, if you were to eat either six egg white omelet, 6 egg whites. Let's boil them. Let's make it as tasteless and gross as possible. You boiled 6 egg whites and you ate them all in omelet form or whatever. Or you sipped 1 tablespoon of olive oil, or you ate 1 banana. So 1 banana, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, or 6 egg whites. Which of those would make you feel the most full? The simple answer.
For me personally, right? I'm not generalizing for everyone.
No, generalize.
Okay. Honestly, or a tablespoon of olive oil, is that what you said?
1 tablespoon olive oil, 1 banana, or 6 egg whites.
I think I would be less likely to eat after the tablespoon.
Really? All right.
Honestly, I'm not honestly sure, but that's my gut instinct. But I would actually have to try it to be fairly honest.
Let's just say, just for the sake of argument, I think most people will probably argue the 6 egg white omelet.
Yeah, I agree.
You think most people would answer? Okay, let's say somebody answers 6 egg white omelet. Now, let's change that paradigm a little bit, because what we're thinking of is protein as a lever to cause you to be full. Like that is the important thing. More protein, more full, right?
Yeah.
What if you had a 6-egg white omelet? Imagine how hungry you'd be later. Okay? So adding more food should only make you more full.
Right.
What if you had 6-egg white omelet? Let's imagine you're trying to eat again in 3 hours. Probably not going to be hungry.
Yep.
What if you had a 6-egg white omelet and a donut? You ate more food. You just added a donut. You still have the 6-egg white omelet. You think you'd be hungry again in 3 hours? Absolutely. Right. You ate more food, and yet you were hungry later. We can explain why that is. We can talk about the carbohydrate insulin model, which I think is widely understood, especially now with some recent publications. But the way I would put it is, when it comes to controlling hunger and cravings, it's less about what you do eat, the 6-egg white omelet, than what you've done. Not eating the donut, or even for some people, not eating the banana, which at least in one study I know, bananas cause a higher blood sugar spike than
and so actually, that's a really good point, because it's often the case that people will be very hungry when chronically restricting calories, whatever they're eating, compared to when they're fasting. When they're fully not eating the shit that makes them hungry, they can actually, after the first 24 hours, they feel actually genuinely they're not hungry. So like you said, it's not about necessarily what you're eating, it's also what you're not eating. And I think this is important for people to realize.
And if you're having more fat, sometimes it helps you not eat the carbs. Again, where you have to have this decision. If you're having the bulletproof coffee, maybe you're not going to have the oatmeal for breakfast, the banana for breakfast, or the thing that would cause you to feel hungry. So I think that's a misnuance. An ironic analogy that I just put out there for humor is, like, when it comes to controlling overeating, consuming a clean diet free of sugar and probably free of carbs is a sundae, and then high protein is the cherry on top.
Right. Right.
But in case it sticks. I think that covers the fullness factor. I think globally what we're talking about is it's well, first of all, about what you don't eat, and it's also doing these short-term studies when you just eat something, you have a bolus of food, and then you see what people eat at a buffet a few hours later, really doesn't capture what people care about, which is consumption over the long term. I think these quote satiety studies don't really capture chronic satiation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, satiety and satiation, and we only talk about satiety, never about the other one, because one is a short-term effect, the other is actually long-term, and you need both, right? If you have a properly regulated system, you can, quote, overeat, but you're not actually overeating because the next day you're compensating, and that's a normal rhythm the body can get into, right? You have times of feast, and then you can go through times of fasting, and it's not that one is a deficit and one is an excess. It's just the range within which your body can accommodate it. You get out of the range when you eat the wrong stuff, or even at the wrong time, potentially. And that's where I would love the focus to be.
Yeah, it becomes so even now, I can tell we're both struggling with the words we want to use. Satiety and satiation are just different forms of the same word, but it's there is just so much nuance here. And so anyway, we did that. But what was the next one you wanted to touch?
Yeah, well, I think for the protein question, that's pretty much it. We veered into CICO. We talked a bit about that.
We didn't talk about the thermic effect of food, though. People talk about that all the time.
Right. Please go ahead. Please go ahead with that.
So the thermic effect of food, for people who don't know, refers to the amount of energy you burn after consuming food, or when you consume food, the number of calories associated with consumption of food. So what people would argue is that the thermic effect of food, which is usually around 10% of your total caloric intake, so say 200 calories out of a 2,000 calorie diet, the thermic effect of food is actually higher for protein. So if you shift calories to protein, then you end up burning more energy while eating the same number of calories. And I found a really interesting 2002 meta-analysis that actually laid out a formula for this, which was thermic effect of food is percent of energy intake equals 0.132 times grams of dietary protein plus 0.015 grams of dietary fat plus 0.054 grams of dietary carbohydrate. So if you look at that laid out, the coefficient on protein is about 2.5 times as much as fat or carbs. So strictly speaking, the thermic effect of food is higher for protein. I agree with that statement. But again, it's one of these misleading comments because it's like, well, what is the effect size? What is the effect size of shifting from a 15% kilocalorie diet from protein to a 30% kilocalorie diet from protein? How many more calories are you going to burn in a day? 23. Right. 23 total calories is all you're burning more in a day, which, what is that?
It's nothing.
It's nothing.
Yeah.
It's nothing. And the magnitude of this effect is small compared to other things. Like we know when holding protein constant, as in the Framingham food study, the effect of shifting carbs to fat was a 200 to 300%, 200 to 300 calorie increase. So this is, again, shifting carbs to fat will increase energy expenditure 200 to 300 calories versus doubling protein intake from 15% to 30% of kilocalories only increases to 23. It's an order of magnitude higher effect for shifting carbs to fat.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think people there's that nuance, and then there's also the nuance of, and this is really interesting. This came out. What was the study? It was like habititium. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. It was a study this year on insulin and the thermic effect of food, and this one blew my mind because I used to think that the thermic effect of food, and I think a lot of people do, has to do with how much energy it takes to mechanically digest food, and that is not the case. The thermic effect of food is more complicated. It has to do how your body couples digestion and macronutrients to whole body energy metabolism. And what they found in this study was that basically when you have insulin signaling at muscle cells, there's a pathway by which this protein called TUG, which is kind of nice, there's actually a tether that holds glucose 4 transporters inside cells and the vesicles. It gets cut, letting the vesicles go to the surface. And they did a really interesting study with TUG deletion and then these TUG constitutive cleaved TUG mouse models that showed that it's not the glucose transporter going to the surface that increases, which contributes to the thermic effect of food, which is basically what they're saying. Like when you get the insulin signaling at the muscle, you have an increase in the thermic effect of food at that time point, right? But it's the C terminus of that protein, which you think is a waste product, that actually does this via cell signaling. I think it was stabilizing like PGC1 alpha and one of the PPARs that increases thermogenesis. So if you delete the protein altogether, glucose transporters still go to the surface, but you have a decrease in the thermic effect of food, you have more obese mice. And if you have a constitutive cleavage, you have an increase in the thermic effect of food, for example. But what they did is, if you overfeed mice and make them obese, I hope I'm representing the study properly. It's been a while since I read it, but this was the gist of it. The big picture idea is going to be correct. Is that if you're, say, insulin resistant, then you're not going to have this signaling cascade working properly. So the thermic effect of food is going to be depressed. So again, it's about much more than just eating protein. First of all, it's a small magnitude effect, but then what is your basal metabolic status? Because your thermic effect of food might be blunted if you're metabolically unhealthy, in which case, maybe you need to go on a low-carb diet because we know that's the best way to reverse metabolic syndrome in most people. Again, the big picture here is not understanding TUG dynamics and the transcriptional cofactors I mentioned. It's understanding there's more nuance to eat more protein, burn more calories.
Yeah, exactly. If it's, I think we're at the point in the research where if you want to say, I'm going to default to higher protein recommendations, totally fine. A lot of rationale for that. If you're going to say, well, I'm going to default to a adequate protein of good quality animal protein, but I'm going to prioritize the fat for now, that's also very defensible. They just both are. Now, my bias is that most people will do well going with a higher protein. That's just my bias. But I'm absolutely going to encourage people to try out the other option when it hasn't worked. I'm just going to expect it not to work for a considerable number of people. And that's what I would love to see reflected a bit more in the discussion, where we don't know these things yet. We don't understand why people can lose fat eating more fat. And we don't understand why some people don't feel as full as others eating protein. And if we can admit we don't know these things, it's much easier to start giving people the nuance and the options, because we want people to have a lot of options to try out.
Yeah, I just don't like the idea of, I think we both agree, one, poorly defining protein. If there's two things I could change, it would be poorly defining protein and vilifying fat, which, you know, in a sense it is. I don't need to, you know, like, there are certain websites, I think we both know what we're referring to, which, you know, are talking about having more protein and putting a big X through things like cheese and bacon and butter. And I find that a little bit problematic.
Well, if you're saying, okay, this is your experiment and this is how you carry it out, I have no problem with putting a big X. But if this is the right way to do a low carb diet, or this is the right way to diet, which is what is being claimed, right? That I'm not okay with, because as you say, what do you mean I can't eat these foods? Of course, there's a considerable amount of people who can eat these foods and be fine. You can't say the same thing about other foods, about snacks and pizzas. That's not true. So you can put a big X in it, whatever diet you do, pretty much, right? For the most part. Yeah. So yeah, it's just this question of it's hard to escape the gravitational pull of this calories in, calories out thinking. And I'm just seeing the low carb world slowly go back to that, from satiety, from the personal fat threshold, from fat, it makes you fat, from this reservoir model. All of these things I'm seeing as like, we're not making progress here. Making progress would be to understand why certain people do better on higher fat versus higher protein, why some people can access their fat and others can't. That's a really important question. And why can some people do well on chronic calorie restriction for, I don't know, 2 months, and someone else after a week, they're done. They just can't do it. And those are the big questions where we can make a lot of progress, I think. So I hope we can address them better.
Yeah, I think both of us are just, we have our first of all, our biases. Everybody has their biases. And also, I don't want to pretend like it's an easy problem to solve, hitting all these nuances at once, because I know from firsthand experience, it's very frustrating when, you know, you're someone who's really working hard to put out content that's accessible to the lay public, like the eye doctor is, and then people are like, you know, couch quarterbacking. Right. And so I think both of us work on, you know, providing our own content. But what we're trying to do here, for whoever might be listening, is just unpack the nuance and think through it together, not offering criticisms of any particular individuals, because I honestly don't have the perfect way to say this to, like, say, the Twitter sphere or the internet, to say, you know, this is what you should focus on, because for everybody it's going to be something different. For some people, that mental shift to say, I'm going to focus on protein, actually helps them put away the fat bombs and the sweeteners, and then they do great. And that might really work for them. And so you might be hitting that niche, but then in focusing on that niche, you miss out on the people that are now going to be like, oh, now I'm fat phobic, I'm restricting 1,200 calories, and now I'm in this block where I can't lose weight and my body composition is crap. So it's really difficult. And I don't think any of us do it perfectly, but that's why it's really interesting to have these conversations. And it's also why it's so great to have people like Brett and Adele, who actually will listen critically, even when.
No, this is they deserve a lot of credit for this. Most people will just, you know, insult or block or ignore and just continue down their path. And to their credit, they took time to answer thoughtfully and actually inquire. And they did that with me, even on the linoleic acid post, where I had some important disagreements there as well. And, you know, I've recommended people go to Diet Doctor website for years and years and years. So, you know, I try to make that clear to them every time. But that's also why I was so insistent on making sure that they didn't, you know, just go backwards, because I still want to recommend people go there, right? It's a super important website.
100%. You did mention, I've been really interested in, well, everybody's interested in seed oils, but I have particular interest. You mentioned linoleic acid. So let's pick up that topic for a minute, because let's put it this way. If I could do one study right now, if I just had whatever resources to do one study, what I would do is I would take, you know, keto adapted individuals. This wouldn't be ethical, but I would basically put them in a no, I wouldn't put them in a metabolic ward. I do free living, but I do meal provisions. I actually don't like metabolic wards because it seems a little bit artificial.
You can do it with doubly labeled water anyways, even free living.
Okay, I would do, free living for 8 weeks, doubly labeled water, and then control all macronutrients, but substitute in different fat sources, particularly, again, calorie controls, things higher in linoleic acid. Like, I'm interested in sesame oil, also in soybean oil is a good example, versus olive oil versus things like cacao butter or coconut oil. And I'd love to see what would happen to body composition, because there's so much speculation around this. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts, your hypotheses, predictions about if you controlled for calories in a fat adapted person and you just shifted the fatty acid profile, what would happen to body composition and why? Because what we know is these molecules are not, again, and they're just energy substrates. They are lipokines. They're signaling molecules, and they change the way our fat distributes. So we do this with GI all the time, but nobody wants to do this manipulation of fatty acids. And I'm super interested because of even just some of the anecdotes I've heard. What do you think? Any thoughts on what would happen?
Yeah, I think that the linoleic acid question this is the issue. There's a lot of evidence of its harms, but the evidence is not concentrated in very clean human RCTs. And therein lies a lot of the issue, I think, because you have to look at the super tightly controlled rat data. You have to look at the best human control data we have, which was, I'm blanking on the name now, but there was this long-term hospital study where they were able to control what they were feeding patients over a couple of years.
Minnesota, the Minnesota.
I think so. I could get the name wrong, but basically that.
That was the one where they went from like an 18. It was like an 18% saturated fat.
Yeah, they were looking at the ratios of.
For a long time, out of University of Minnesota. No, never mind. Okay, no, I don't think it was. This one wasn't looking at body composition. It was looking at cardiovascular outcome. But in any case, I think we both look like there's really interesting mouse data, but it's like athymic mice in which you had. I was Fire in a Bottle was DMing me because I was asking him, and he was sending me some cool papers. It was like, this is actually really interesting. I'm interested, but athymic mice where you have non-esterified stearic acid versus other fatty acids, and that's really hard. And again, it's not keto mice per se. It's like a standard macro distribution, and you're just trading in the fatty acids. Extrapolating from that to human data, or what would happen in humans is you just can't. And I read. I resurrected this from like 2011 or 2013, some N=1 experiment where somebody basically just exchanged the oils she put on for salads for something that was lower proof or higher proof. She had no change in body weight, but a lot of gain in, not visceral adiposity, but fat per stomach. So that, and I've heard other people say similar. That basically, more or less, if they just exchange this fat for that fat, they don't tend to eat more, but they tend to have more belly fat or worse body composition. I'm just interested in how this could be. And I've been looking at a couple of papers. I tweeted one the other day about oxylipins and PUFAs and visceral fat, and that was really interesting. I think the cytochrome 450, P450 pathway, and you can look at that one. Let's talk about that one later. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. It's just something I wanted to bring up to see if you had thoughts, because that is the one study that I'd love to do right now. Just change the fatty acid profiles and see what happens to body composition. Because we know that you can do that with, say, carbohydrates, where you're controlling for carbohydrates and calories, but if you change starch for sugar or sugar for starch, you'll have, say, a gain in visceral fat, or just more fat gain, in part because you have the spike in insulin. So that overlaps with CICO or
just to close the loop on that, what I was saying is that basically we've got a pretty good human study over a couple of years showing an immediate divergence in all-cause mortality, favoring saturated fat and not favoring linoleic acid. So when you have these changes over a significant period of time in a relatively well-controlled manner, and you can look at all-cause mortality and you see this immediate separation, which does suggest dose-dependent effects, which is actually important when you're trying to establish a causal link. That, to me, is quite convincing. Then you've got the whole aspect about what these fats are doing at the electron transport chain level. And this is a really cool thing. When things are happening at that level, it's much more, the animal data becomes much more relevant, because evolutionarily speaking, these mitochondrial structures and mechanism, they're highly conserved. So you can't, the criticism of, well, it's a mouse model, I mean, it's still, you can still use it, but it carries much less weight than for many other questions that don't necessarily concern the mitochondria. And so it's, again, there's this nuance in what are the proposed mechanisms and are these conserved across different animal models? And that's why I made the point that you kind of have to be clever with linoleic acid, because you have to look at multiple different models and make sense of it with the human data. For example, we have these experiments where people ate muffins and they were high in linoleic acid, and people with saturated fat tended to do worse with liver steatosis compared to those guys. Now, if you take those things at face value, sure, saturated fat is bad, linoleic acid is great. But if you understand the experiments that showed how it acts on the mitochondria, you can immediately understand that the effects you are seeing are short-term, and that if you carry this experiment out longer term, you would see a negative impact of linoleic acid, because the short-term impact is positive because you're sequestering this excess energy within your fat stores, which are doing their job of energy buffer. The problem is you're borrowing on your metabolic buffering capacity, and long-term, you're going to get all the bad things like diabetes and eventually obesity, which is how you compensate with it. So you need to have this time frame in mind as well when you're looking at it.
Yeah, I can't. As opposed to stable, but yeah, I try to invalidate some of these models or claim these strong conclusions about this is good, this is bad, or X, Y, Z. When we know that adaptation to pretty much any diet at multiple levels, like a single feeding study or a 6-day study, it's useful if you draw the right conclusions and if you're asking the same questions, but it has a much higher risk of being very, very misleading. So maybe a pretty shitty example, but I'm going to pull it anyway, is like, I think we'd agree eating, sugary tropical fruits probably not the best thing for diabetes. And yet, or let's make it even more extreme. Having Mountain Dew, regular Mountain Dew, probably not good for diabetes. That said, if somebody is in a, is hypo, and they're having, a hypo crisis, then for sure, give them some Mountain Dew to get them out of that. That would be good acute care, but you shouldn't extrapolate that logic to say, oh, Mountain Dew helps control diabetes. And I feel like that sounds really, really silly, pull that analogy, but people do it much more than I think people realize. All right, I can't share screen. I wanted to show you my tweet from a couple days ago about that Nature article about soybean oil, but forget it. I'm just looking at it.
No worries. That's fine. But how about this? Let's close out with you telling us what's coming up for you, because I think there are some interesting conferences that you'll be speaking at, and I want to give people a chance to catch you later on.
Sure. Well, as you know, I mean, both of us we're still small fish in this sea. We're making our place, but we're having fun. And so I really only, a few months ago, I got my PhD back in November. And since then, I've been having lots of fun getting on a lot of different, little podcasts, having good talks. And probably my first big, quote, lecture, I'm talking at Low-Carb International All-Stars in June. So it's June 19th to 20th, which will be fun. I was humbled by the fact that my face was next to Tim Noakes in the lineup.
Right.
Well, I don't know if we beside each other, but I'll be talking about more to my area of expertise, which is neurodegeneration and the connection between our nutrition, specifically ketogenic diets, and brain degeneration at a very metabolic level. We're looking at something particularly called ApoE4 and taking, I think, a little bit of a twist on it that hasn't been taken before. And this will be fun for me because I never really talk in a structured way about my area of expertise. Like right now, we're talking about protein and calories in, calories out. It's like neither of us can claim to per se be authorities on that, given where our research focuses. It's fun to talk about, but this will be different because I'm actually going to be talking about something that I do a PhD in. So that'll be fun. And then I'm just busy working on a whole bunch of different projects, some with Harvard, some with just, I have a new book out on a keto diet. It's right now #1 in low-carb diet. So it's the new Mediterranean diet cookbook. And actually,
Gotcha.
I wanna talk about that just for a second because I think this has to do with nuance in marketing, and I think a lot of people are probably going to give me some heat for promoting a Mediterranean diet.
I'll give you heat.
All right, give me heat. I'll let you go at it first, and then I'll explain why I like this concept.
The Mediterranean diet has been a bastardized term used to mean everything and anything. And it's particularly frustrating for someone who's actually living and who in the Mediterranean and who's been brought up there and who's had a chance to taste a lot of a variety of Mediterranean food. And again, if it's a heuristic, totally cool. But the problem is this diet has been defined very specifically in some very big randomized trials, actually, as you know. And you have to define it narrowly in order to use it scientifically. The problem is it's not possible. By definition, it's a varied diet. So therein lies my rub with it. And it can be used to make plant-based diet look good, yet, meat is the central part of the Mediterranean diet. It just is. It's salami, it's cheese, it's escargot if you're in France. It's just not. People think you go to the Med and you eat a ton of vegetables. I'll ask people, go to Sardinia, see what they serve you at the restaurant. When I went there a few years ago, it was basically a ton of different meat or fish, right? Shellfish, all of that stuff, pork. And then you had a little side portion of vegetables, maybe a little fruit. And this was not one restaurant. This was everywhere. This was everywhere. So once again, it's like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I know. So again, supporting a model that is, I think some people would argue, has been harmful. And I actually hear that argument. So the reason I'm bringing it up is because I battled with how difficult it is to, do what's useful to the populace and do what's nuanced. So anyway, the reason I went for it is in part because, I was like reading the U.S. News and World Report this year with Mark Cucuzella. We wrote a rebuttal on it because, again, #1 diet, Mediterranean, out of 39 diets. Number 39 out of 39 for health, which is the bottom of the list, keto. And the biggest loser was in the middle, where like biggest loser was, 17, keto was 39, which I don't get how they pulled that logic. But again, intention perception. The perception by the broad population is that Mediterranean is healthy, and what that creates is a little bit of a block. If the perception of keto is meat and cheese, because it makes it really, pardon the pun, unpalatable for the masses. So I think, my goal, where I see myself being useful given my positioning, is to open this up and kind of titrate in the message with a concept like Mediterranean keto, where we're saying, no, look, these things aren't mutually exclusive. The keto is actually a very broad, I would say, open-minded area and perpendicular or complementary to all these different diets, including Mediterranean, which, as you said, isn't necessarily what people think it means. It does not mean healthy whole grains. It's obviously grain-free, as you would presume. It doesn't mean fear of saturated fat. We have quoting from the JACC and Nina Teicholz on her contribution, which was a tzatziki, basically saying, the idea that saturated fat causes heart disease is bunk. But I think this idea of grabbing onto a concept that people appreciate, whether it be high protein or Mediterranean, and using it to Trojan horse in the idea, or titrate in the idea, I think that's useful. And so I don't know to what extent the idea of Mediterranean keto is helpful versus high protein is helpful. I think this is a very complicated area. Anyway, that's my goal with the book, and it's ironic because personally, I eat a low fiber diet.
Right.
And the book is, relatively high fiber, all things being equal, although I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either. But if you start to open people's minds up different ways, be it high protein, be it X, Y, or Z, Mediterranean keto, then you kind of like, the way I see this, as it's kind of like a chess game, we all have our parts to play. So if I do the job of like titrating in the message, then maybe somebody won't be so offended by Paul Saladino saying just, be carnivore. I think Sean Baker is so nice, and I like him a lot. If people just know him from Twitter, then they're probably not their favorite person. But again, he's one of those people that's actually pretty nuanced. His message about meat being important to health is pretty good when you start to dig into it. So it's like I see myself as the goal of this book, in part, is to open people's minds about it, and also physicians' minds. I can't tell you how many people I have come to me and say that like my doctor doesn't want me to go on keto, he suggests Mediterranean. Right. Do a book that says the Mediterranean, new Mediterranean diet cookbook, and it's a keto-friendly diet. I've actually had a lot of doctors jump at it and then buy it, and it's just one more way to play with how to articulate this, which is really the crux of what we're talking about here. Like, how the heck do we? Because I don't think any of us have a good answer. We criticize Diet Doctor a little bit. And I'm trying to criticize myself here because I just want to make it clear that like everybody in this space that's communicating, whether it's Brett Sure, me, yourself, Ted Naiman, whoever, hopefully should be self-critical and thinking about like, is my message being perceived with, is my intent and the perception matching up? And if not, why? Because it's very easy to get defensive about your intent and saying, but this is what I meant. And I've done that, and I probably will continue to do that, and it's not productive.
So, I know what you mean. I respect the strategy. I just hope it works. Best of luck, and you're right to try. I think Trojan horses are fine. As long as when you're discussing it, you can discuss it in its full spectrum, and the where it falls short and where it's useful. That's fine. Again, difference between hypotheses, theories, heuristics, practical aspects. When you tease these things out, we can make progress. So best of luck with it. I would love to talk to you again about neurodegeneration, because I also study the brain in my PhD in metabolism. So I'm sure we have a ton to talk about there, and we haven't yet, but we will. And yeah, just when is the?
What's coming up for you? I know you're interviewing me, but this is a back and
forth. Oh yeah.
Or whatever. What's going on for you?
Well, for me, it's I've been writing articles for thepaleodiet.com. I wrote about protein, dogs, and humans, and this coevolution that seemed to happen. I wrote about ulcerative colitis, a 2-part article on that, to give people an overview of what it is, the different treatments that are available. It's not comprehensive, but it's pretty wide-ranging. I wrote about how to fuel your brain best, very generally speaking. And did I write about? Oh yeah, and about the original human diet, the evolutionary human diet that I argue is a hypercarnivore from this big paper that we published.
Oh, but what about? And I'm teeing you up for this one. But did you see the thing that came out of? I think it was HMS. About the Neanderthals and the bacteria on their teeth. Did you read that piece?
Yeah. Well, I read it yesterday, and we're actually going to write a letter to the editor with Mickey Bendor and Rand Barkai, the co-authors on this paper we published. And I can just go very briefly, and these are most of these are Mickey's analyses. But essentially, plaque builds up from starch. So if you're looking at good samples of plaque, you will be looking at samples that have had a lot of starch by definition. So you've got an inherent bias built into what you're looking into, first of all.
So just tell people first what they concluded. What do they conclude?
Yeah, basically they took teeth that had plaque on it, and this is like contains information. right, from Neanderthals, so very, very, very old humans. Basically, they're not exactly
No,
humans, but they're related to
they
us.
weren't because they went extinct. That's
Right,
one of the
right.
many jokes. But yeah, they did
Yeah,
not evolve into us. They did not. This is a
right.
separate
They did not evolve
that
into
died
us,
off.
right? We're related to them. They look very much like us in many respects, so they're very useful comparisons. And these people said they have a lot of plaque, and the stuff that's in their plaque, the bacteria, the microbiome, is suggesting that there's a big need for them to break down starch. Ergo, Neanderthals seem to eat a considerable amount of starch. Now, the first big problem is that this is a qualitative result, not a quantitative one. So that's a massive problem because you could just be chewing on tubers, right? Or you could be eating tons of cooked potatoes and you wouldn't be able to distinguish necessarily because it's qualitative, not quantitative. So that's the first issue. Then the timeline they were looking at, it accounted for less than 1% of our evolutionary timeline. So the conclusions they're drawing are from such a restricted point that it's not representative of what we see.
They went further with their conclusion. They were concluding that we can contribute, well, they were implying at least that we can contribute consumption of starches and glucose-rich vegetables with the expansion of the human brain.
Right. Yes.
They actually said like they went that far, and that's what really ticked me off. Some of they even said like, you know, we need glucose-rich, high-calorie foods for our brain to expand. Like, who's claiming that? That was utter nonsense. So you're taking, you're taking a bias sample from flax, in which the maltose amylase is biased from, an organism that one could argue is out-competed, out-hunted by humans, that then went extinct. So it's not even us, and that their brains expanded because of them eating starches, and so our brains expanded because of us eating starches, and that means we should be plant-based, not meat-based. The way I read it, and maybe I'm just sensitive, and this is not, again, the intent versus the perception, but the way I read it was they're trying to debunk the concept that eating meat and cooking or eating fish, which that's Michael Crawford over in England, helped our brains expand. That eating these animals' food, be it meat or DHA-rich fish, help our brains expand for cooking. They're saying, no, it's the plants.
Right.
And that's what took me off a little bit, because it was a really problematic series of leaps of logic. But I had a lot of people
hit you up with
emailing me saying, Nick, what do you think about this? Because they know kind of like, where I'm at. And so these are the things that get read. Yeah.
And the last point I'll make about it there was that there was also, it's funny because it actually they don't know this, I think, and we'll maybe point it out in our letter to the editor. But actually, if you look at the timeline and the increase in starch consumption that they were looking at towards the end of the Upper Paleolithic, that actually fits with what we've argued, because we've argued we were basically hypercarnivores, but towards the end of the Paleolithic, we did see a decrease from that 70%, more than 70% kilocalories, because we did start including more plant matter. There is evidence of that. And we know it fits with the decrease in prey size and decrease in availability of large game. So you could take their exact results and argue for the exact opposite dietary pattern, which is kind of interesting because they did the exact opposite, as you said.
Yeah, it's just about what is the plant-based movement is big. It's a little bit of almost pandering. And again, I don't think either of us are trying to be anti-plant by any means. It's just trying to, I guess, bust the appropriate myths. Because what follows from, and this is again like leaps. This is domino one, which suggests plant-based, which suggests meat is bad, which suggests XYZ. Yeah,
exactly.
We keep on getting pulled back into this this trap of harmful myths that seem really innocent. And
they're not.
I wish I could read that and be like, oh, this is a fun fact. Neanderthals have like starchy teeth. I wish it was that simple. And they have some great stuff coming out as well. But I think for those things get picked up on because they're controversial and because they're pokey, and that is just the way that cookie crumbles in media. And it's the same with high protein. It's like when you have like a 24-ounce steak is going to probably get more likes than you and me talking about tug cleavage and PGC1 alpha and blah blah blah. But
it's okay. We had fun.
You know, this is more or less what it's about. You just having fun and almost venting a little bit. This is like a
Yeah, but anyways, let's have some time down the road when we're less busy. We'll have a podcast on neurodegeneration because there's a ton to explore there.
How about brain evolution and neurodegeneration?
Perfect. I love that. So Nick, thanks for taking the time. Just tell people your Twitter handle so they can find you easily.
I'm at Nick Norwitz on Twitter. So yeah, follow me.
Perfect.
Maybe we
all
can
right.
talk about oxylipids and stuff.
Yes, yes, people do that. So thanks, Nick. Thanks everyone for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.